So let's spend some time talking about this, curriculum standards, and the influence they have on our role as educators. So our questions that we want to think through today are these. Who decides what will be taught in my classroom? We're also going to consider how do state curriculum standards influence curriculum, assessment, and instruction. Now we have a number of learning objectives that are tied to our understanding of curriculum standards. Let's start with the first two. We need to be able to locate and use appropriate content standards in the planning of curriculum and instruction. We also need to understand content and content standards, as well as how these are organized into our curriculum. It's important to understand the difference between standards and curriculum. So let's take a look at how this works at a state level. In a state like Arizona and other states, a standards framework is adopted at the state level. So Arizona educators and citizens work with the Arizona Department of Education to write, review, and revise these standards. These standard frameworks are an outline of what students need to learn in schools all around the state. Teachers, regardless of what school they teach in, are required to make sure that these are taught to their students because they've been developed by the State Board of Education and approved at the state level. But again, this just focuses on what students need to learn. Curriculum, on the other hand, focuses on how an educator teaches students. And this is based on what happens at a local level. Local teachers and administrators, they recommend the curriculum, for example, textbooks, instructional programs, resources. And then locally elected school boards adopt a curriculum. In other words, the decisions about how an educator teaches students are left up to local school districts, local schools, as well as individual teachers. So even though various schools around the state are responsible for the same what regarding what needs to be taught, around the state, different schools will approach how to teach those students a little bit differently. And that is the difference between standards, the what is being taught, versus the curriculum, how it is taught. So remember, our question was, how much control does a teacher have over what is taught in the classroom? The reality is, what is being taught is determined at a state level, whereas the how things will be taught is a decision that's left largely up to schools, districts, and educators themselves. Now, in each state, states such as Idaho, the content standards is viewable by educators and the rest of the public. So as a teacher, I'm responsible to know the content standards in my content area and specific to my grade level. So let's say, for example, I teach English language arts at the 8th grade level. I would need to go to my state's education website and find the standards that have been adopted for my content area and my grade level. So here's English language arts. I click on the standards. And at this point, it's my responsibility to be familiar with several things. How my standards document is organized, what are the big ideas and skills that all English language arts teachers would focus on, as well as how the standards themselves break down. So in the case of English language arts, there are 10 key ideas and details that every educator will focus on who teaches English language arts. But when it's broken down into individual grade levels, I can see the differences. So if I look at kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, I can see the same standards side by side as it is intended to be taught at different grade levels. I can also see the major categories of content and skills that I am responsible to teach. I can see that I need to teach reading of literature. I can see that I need to teach reading of informational texts, as well as I also need to help my students develop foundational skills in print, phonological awareness, phonics, word recognition, fluency. And so as I go through my standards, I can see how I'm responsible for not only reading, but writing, use of language, speaking and listening. So as educators, we need to be able to access and understand the standards that have been adopted for our content area and the grade level of students that we teach. So to summarize, state curriculum framework set forth essential content to be taught grade by grade. Then the district curriculum guides provide content goals, sample teaching activities, as well as outlines aligned to the state curriculum. And then comes our responsibility. The teacher's unit or lesson plans are to describe how curriculum goals are implemented on a daily basis. This includes topics covered, materials, learning activities, assessments, and student accommodations and modifications. This allows us as teachers to make and maintain records that include which objectives have been mastered, grades, monitoring of progress of our individual students, as well as identifying concepts and skills that need to be retaught. So state-adopted standards allow us to develop outcomes or learning objectives for our students for each and every lesson. These standards and outcomes help us determine what assessment and evidence pieces we'll use to gather information about how well our students are meeting learning goals, as well as to design success criteria and rubrics, as well as other elements such as essential and guiding questions and the actual learning activities. Unfortunately, what sometimes happens is we as educators get really excited to develop a lesson without aligning it to standards or outcomes. The result is a learning experience that's disconnected from what we actually want students to know and be able to do. So let's take a look at this classroom as an example. Mr. Sullivan is having a great time teaching about the Civil War, and his 11th grade U.S. history class is having fun too. Mr. Sullivan is relating all kinds of anecdotes about the war. He describes a battle fought in the nude, a group of Confederates was caught fording the river, the time Stonewall Jackson lost a battle because he took a nap in the middle of it, and several stories about women who disguised their gender to fight as soldiers. He tells a story of a Confederate raid from Canada on a Vermont bank. He passes around real mini balls and grape shot. Those are a type of ammo, by the way. In fact, Mr. Sullivan has gone on for weeks about the battles, the songs, the personalities, and the foibles of generals. Finally, after an interesting math activity in which students have to figure out how much Confederate money they would need to buy a loaf of bread, Mr. Sullivan has his students put away all the materials to take a test. The students are shocked. The only question on the test is, what were the main causes, events, and consequences of the Civil War? Now, many of us have had an experience like this in the classroom. We're participating, we feel as though we're learning, but when it comes time to take an assessment, we feel very ill-prepared. In other words, there's a disconnect between what is taught and what is being assessed. The truth is that Mr. Sullivan's lessons are fun, they're engaging, they use varied presentation modes, they integrate skills from other disciplines. They are clearly accomplishing one important goal of social studies, building enjoyment of the topic. However, as engaging as Mr. Sullivan's lessons are, there's little correspondence between what he is teaching and what he is assessing and evaluating. In other words, he and his students are on a happy trip, but where are they going? If our assessments, our learning activities, and our outcomes are not aligned, this is what it feels like in the classroom: disconnected. In order to design effective instruction for our students, we need to think about this process, backward design. It's called backward design because we start with the end in mind. We start by identifying what are our desired results. What are the big ideas and skills that we want students to end up with? Then we determine acceptable evidence. In other words, what will be the culminating assessment task that will result in evidence from each individual student? Only then do we begin to plan learning experiences and instruction, the actual learning events. If we're not careful, as teachers, we can get far too excited about developing the learning experiences. According to backward design, these should only be developed if we've already identified our desired results, as well as what acceptable evidence or culminating assessment task we will use to measure student progress and success. Again, we call it backward design because it starts with the end in mind. We might also call it backward design because to many teachers, designing the learning events last feels a little bit backward. So let's take a look at this. We want to be able to create objectives with corresponding assessments that are aligned to the content standards. Again, the first step of backward design is to identify our desired results, the big ideas and skills that our students need to develop. Think of it this way. Teaching is much like an airplane journey. From the time we take off, we will be off course 99% of the time. That's right, 99% of the time. The purpose and role of the pilot and the avionics is to continually bring the plane back on course so that it arrives on schedule at its destination. In the classroom, you as a teacher are the pilot of a plane that will take your students to a desired destination. Now, we don't necessarily want to be off track 99% of the time in our classroom. However, knowing our destination, where we want our students to be able to end up, what we want them to know and be able to do, is crucial to making adjustments during our class time. That's why we work at setting learning objectives. As we work to design learning experiences for our students, we must ask ourselves, what will my students know and be able to do as a result of this lesson? And remember that these outcomes we develop for our students should be very closely aligned to the standards that have been adopted at the state level. So here are 3 important principles for designing learning objectives for our students. First, learning objectives should seek to narrow down what it is that students need to focus on. Second, objectives should be descriptive but not too specific. For example, we don't want our objectives to say something like, describe the process of photosynthesis in 4 sentences that address each component of the process listed in the textbook. Instead, consider something more like this. Describe the elements and importance of each component of photosynthesis. Notice this is descriptive but not too specific, as in the case before it. The third principle for learning objectives is this. Students should be encouraged to personalize the teacher's learning goals and/or translate them into their own words. You see, these learning objectives aren't written for teachers as much as they're written for students to clarify what is the direction for learning. So as we write our learning objectives, here are 5 things to keep in mind. They should be relevant to the curriculum standards. They should always include an action verb that specifies something observable that students can complete. They should also include an action verb that specifies something observable that the student can perform. In addition, they should be clear, easy to understand, and unambiguous. Of course, we also want our learning objectives to be developmentally appropriate for the age and background of our students and to promote learning across learning domains, to develop students cognitively, affectively, and in the psychomotor domain. For example, our learning objectives could read, describes the function of each part of the circulatory system, identifies the parts of a microscope, distinguishes between probable and improbable economic forecast, differentiates between facts and inferences. Pause right here and select one of the 4 of these learning objectives. Then check it against the criteria that's listed above. So why do we need these instructional objectives? Well, it provides focus for instruction, provides guidelines. It also provides targets when we design our formative and summative assessments. Clear instructional objectives also convey instructional intent to others outside of the classroom. And ultimately, they help us to provide evaluation of our instruction. So now let's talk about this, knowing when and how to evaluate and report learner progress against standards. In other words, when do we assess and report learner progress against standards that have been established? One time when this is appropriate is during formative assessment. In other words, during instruction, teachers may decide to assess student understanding and progress towards standards mastery in order to evaluate how effective is their instructional design. Both the teacher and the student, individually and then together, review and reflect on the outcomes. For example, let's take a look at this teacher's notebook. Here there is a checklist of the different standards for numbers and operations in Base 10. These are taken from the content standards that have been adopted by her state. Each student's performance is listed in connection to each of these standards. This way the teacher knows which standards the student is doing well at and which ones they might need more instruction in. Students can also be encouraged to keep their own version of the notebook that would just include the standards as well as their individual score. Doing so allows them to meet together, then review and reflect on the assessment outcomes. Another time that standards come into play is during benchmark assessments. Now, these assessments can serve curriculum and instruction planning purposes by providing educators the information they need to adjust curriculum, as well as instruction to meet student learning needs. But in order for this to happen, these benchmark assessments must be aligned with content standards and major learning goals and provide reliable information on student strengths and weaknesses relative to those goals. For example, let's take a look at this teacher and this student involved in a benchmark assessment.
Okay, this is a book called A Call for Change, and in this book, it's an essay written by a girl named Rachel, and Rachel writes to the editor of the newspaper to make a proposal. You're going to read to find out the problem she wants to solve, and you can begin whenever you're ready.
Rachel Wood was a winner of Mr. Winston's 8th grade essay contest this year. Rachel's forced personally need to stay safe, learn, and grow into successful adults that everyone can be proud of.
Nice job. Okay. From reading this letter, what kind of person do you think Rachel is?
A nice person who wants to help citizens.
How did the author of this book make Rachel sound like a strong person?
He put in some words that made her like really smart.
Do you remember any of the words that made you think that she sounded smart?
Improvements.
Rehabilitate?
Yeah.
Any other words that she used that made her sound like a strong person?
Grumbling.
Okay, and why was Rachel's essay effective?
It tells you some important things about her community.
Okay, you did a great job and you're all set. You can go back to your class.
Thank you.
Another time that standards come into play are with summative assessments or cumulative assessments. These are intended to capture what a student has learned or the quality of learning and then judge performance against some standard. So unlike the formative assessments, which are generally used for providing feedback to students and teachers, summative assessments are generally more high-stakes assessments and used to get the final assessment of how much learning has taken place. In other words, how much does a student know? And one of the most common summative assessments used in schools are mandated tests by the state. These tests go through periodic revisions which are based on the curriculum standards adopted in various forms by various states. So let's take a look at how the standards come into play with the state-mandated tests. So let's take a look at this state math test. There are 32 questions for this test, and each is correlated with a standard. Students are provided a mathematics reference sheet, as well as tips for taking the test, and then complete each of the questions assigned. Since each question is connected with a specific standard, we're able to make a more specific determination how well a student has mastered each individual element or standard. This is much more helpful information than just getting an overall score on an exam. Now let's look at our last learning objective. We want to be able to individually and with others in our field select and create learning experiences that are appropriate for the curriculum goals and content standards, but are also relevant to our learners. In other words, the question we ask ourselves is how do we get our students and ourselves excited to tackle content standards? Well, one thing we can do is we can make our students aware of the learning objectives before and during class time. Let them know where we are headed. What are the desired knowledge pieces and skills that they need to master? For example, let's look at this learning objective. We want to be able to analyze or look closely at probability and frequency tables to make and justify predictions. We could introduce the lesson with this story of the Challenger space shuttle, the first time that a teacher was permitted to go up into space with NASA astronauts. We can tell them how every television set in the United States had people gathered around it, both at home and in schools, to watch this space shuttle take flight. But shortly after taking off, it became very clear that something was wrong. There was an explosion and different parts of the space shuttle went different directions. Teachers in that terrible moment did their best to explain to their students what happened, as they stood witness to not only a teacher, but all of the astronauts being killed on board. Then we ask our students, could this terrible tragedy have been prevented? We hand to students a table that shows the probability of O-rings failing. The O-ring, by the way, is the part of the space shuttle apparatus that failed, creating the explosion. We ask students to look closely at this table and determine what patterns or trends do they see. Could you take some time and do the same? Now, if we look closely, we can see that the warmer the temperature, the less likely it is for the O-ring to fail. There's a 0% probability, with a few anomalies here and there. But as the air temperature drops, there's a much higher likelihood of that O-ring failing. Then we ask our students to look up the temperature at the launch site the day this space shuttle went up into the air. What they will soon find is that the temperature was well below what is on our graph. In other words, we had sound statistical evidence that showed it was too cold to launch the aircraft that day. At this point, we take our students back to our learning objective. That will be our goal for today, students. We will analyze or look closely at probability frequency tables to make and justify predictions. We need to use tables such as these to make predictions that might actually save lives. Our question for today's lesson will be, how can we use probability and frequency tables to save lives and prevent other tragedies, like the one we just looked at? So again, as teachers, we must ask ourselves, what do we want our students to know and be able to do as a result of the lesson? That answer comes as we look closely at our standards to develop outcomes for our students. It comes as we work on the first element of backward design, which is to identify desired results, to make very clear to students the big ideas and skills for the day.